I was still hooked up to the IV when I called my daughter-in-law Claire and said, "The doctor says I can't go upstairs alone for at least 3 weeks." There was a pause on the line. Then she said, very carefully, the way people speak when they've already decided something, "Margaret, we just can't rearrange our whole lives right now." I heard my son Daniel in the background. "Tell her to look into home care." The call ended. I lay there in that hospital bed in Kelowna, staring at the ceiling tiles, counting the water stains the way you count things when you're trying not to cry. A few minutes later, a woman in blue scrubs walked in to check my blood pressure. She was maybe 40, with tired eyes and a calm way of moving through a room. She noticed my face, didn't say anything right away. Just adjusted the cuff, waited for the reading, and then said quietly, "You doing okay?" I said I was fine. She looked at me the way nurses do when they know you're lying. "Your son coming?" I shook my head. She nodded once, slowly, and said, "Well, you've got us for now." I didn't know then that the woman standing beside that hospital bed would eventually become more family to me than the family I'd spent 67 years building. People talk about loneliness less like it only happens after someone dies. They're wrong. The real loneliness is quieter than that. It arrives in small moments. A phone call that ends too soon. A room that stays empty when you expected a face at the door. My husband Roy had been gone for 9 years when I finally understood what loneliness really meant. Before he died, our house in Kelowna was noisy in the good way. Roy played old country records on Sunday mornings, burned toast every single weekend, argued cheerfully with the hockey game on television. Daniel used to tease him. "Dad, the Leafs can't hear you." Roy would grin and turn the volume up anyway. Those were the years I thought would last forever. They didn't. The morning of my knee replacement, I sat alone in pre-op, wearing a thin paper gown, while nurses moved around me, doing their efficient, practiced work. My hands were cold. I kept checking the door. Daniel had promised, "Mom, I'll be there before they take you in." He said it 3 days earlier on the phone. He sounded rushed even then, but I believed him, because I've always believed him. You don't stop believing your children, even when you probably should. An hour passed, then another. "No, Daniel." I finally texted. "Are you on your way?" His reply came 11 minutes later. "Sorry, Mom. Ryan's game got moved to this morning. Can't miss it." I stared at that message for a long time. My grandson Ryan was 12 years old and his hockey game was more important than his grandmother going under general anesthetic. I understood, I told myself. I kept telling myself that while they wheeled me down the hallway. I woke up to pain, the thick and blurry kind that arrives before you remember where you are. Someone was adjusting something near my arm. I opened my eyes and the room came into focus slowly. "The same nurse from before," she said. "There you are. Surgery went well." I swallowed. Asked about Daniel without saying his name. Just said, "Has anyone?" She looked at the empty chair by the window and back at me. "Not yet," she said gently. Something in my chest went quiet in a way that felt permanent. Later that evening, when I finally called Daniel myself, I could hear Claire moving around in the kitchen behind him. Hockey highlights on the television. A normal Tuesday evening. I said, "I'm out of recovery." He said, Good. How are you feeling?" I said, "Sore. The doctor says I'll need some help at home for a few weeks." And the silence that followed was the kind that tells you everything before a single word is spoken. "Mom," he said finally, "this is the worst possible timing." I asked him what he meant. "We've got Ryan's tournament in Penticton this weekend, and Claire's been covering extra shifts, and the basement reno isn't done yet, so your room isn't even usable right now." I said, "I'm not asking to move in, Daniel. I'm asking for some help." Claire's voice in the background. "She can hire someone, Daniel." I heard every word. He knew I heard every word. The silence after that was different, heavier, the kind that sits between people who are pretending they didn't just say something unforgivable. "We love you, Mom," he said. "We just can't drop everything." He hung up shortly after. I didn't cry right away. I just sat there with the phone in my lap, while the hallway outside my room filled with the ordinary sounds of a hospital at night. Somewhere down the corridor, someone was laughing. Machines beeped. A cart squeaked past my door, and I thought about all the times I had dropped everything. The nurse came back that evening to bring my evening medication. She found me staring at the wall. She set the little cup on my tray and then did something unexpected. She sat down in the chair beside my bed. Not for long, maybe 5 minutes. But she sat down. "What's your name?" I asked. She said, "Yvonne Bellaire." I said mine. We shook hands, which felt absurd and also entirely right. And over the next 2 days, Yvonne Bellaire became the only familiar thing I had in that place. She helped me learn to use the walker without apologizing for needing it. She brought me a second cup of tea in the mornings, because she noticed I finished the first one too fast. She found an extra pillow for my leg, and remembered without being asked. She laughed at my jokes, which weren't all that funny, and she never once less looked at me like I was a problem to be managed. When you get to my age, you notice the difference. On my second night, I woke up around 2 in the morning and couldn't get back to sleep. Yvonne was passing my room and saw the light on. She stopped at the doorway. "Can't sleep?" I said no. She came in and stood near the window for a moment, looking out at the parking lot lights. "I used to think the worst thing about getting older was the body," I said. She turned around. I said, "Now I think it's realizing who actually shows up." She didn't rush to fill the silence the way younger people do. She just nodded. Then she said, "Sometimes the people who show up aren't who we expected." I don't know why those words stayed with me all night. Maybe because somewhere underneath them I already knew something had shifted. Not just in that hospital room. In me, the morning they discharged me, Daniel did not come. Claire sent a text. "Hope you're feeling better. Let us know if you need anything." An exclamation mark. As if a punctuation mark could substitute for a body in a doorway. I stood in the discharge area with my walker and my overnight bag while the volunteer at the front desk asked cheerfully if my ride had arrived. I started to say something vague, and then I heard my name. Yvonne was at the end of her shift, still in her scrubs, car keys in hand. She said, "I figured you might need a lift." I told her she didn't have to do that. She said, "I know," and picked up my bag. The drive to my house in East Kelowna took 20 minutes. She didn't fill it with noise. The radio was off. The mountains were doing what they do in October, going gold and gray at the same time. When we pulled into my driveway, I felt the dread of it. The house that used to feel like home felt like a test now. Every step inside would be a negotiation. Yvonne helped me in, made sure I was settled on the couch, filled a glass of water, put it where I could reach without getting up. Before she left, she handed me a piece of paper. Her number. "Call me if something feels wrong," she said. I told her she'd already done too much. She said, "Nobody's ever done too much for someone who needed help." Then she left. That evening I discovered the filing cabinet. I'd gone to look for my medication insurance papers, which I kept in the second drawer of the cabinet in the spare room. The drawer was not the way I'd left it. I've kept those files the same way for 11 years. Since Roy organized them before his diagnosis, everything has a place. The folders were out of order. Some were crooked. One folder I didn't recognize was near the front, a manila envelope with a sticky note on it that said Review, DH, which are Daniel's initials. Inside was a printed email chain. The first was from Daniel to a financial planning firm in Vancouver. It read, "My mother is 67 and recently widowed. Her cognitive function has been declining slightly. She repeats herself, misplaces things. I'm concerned she may not be able to manage her affairs independently much longer. I'd like to understand the process for family-initiated financial oversight." I read that sentence 4 times. Cognitive function has been declining. I repeat myself, I misplace things. Because once, at Thanksgiving, I told the same story twice. Because last winter, I left my reading glasses in the car. That was the evidence my son had submitted to a financial planning firm as grounds for taking over my accounts. I sat down on the edge of the spare bed and held those papers in my hands until they stopped shaking enough to read the rest. There were 3 more emails, each one a little more specific. Mentions of Roy's estate, the property value of the house, investment accounts. One line near the bottom read, "Is there a mechanism for a family member to obtain oversight without going through a formal capacity assessment?" Without going through a formal capacity assessment. He didn't want a doctor involved. He just wanted access. I called Yvonne that night. I don't know why her, instead of a friend, instead of my sister in Saskatoon. Maybe because she was the only person who'd been honest with me in weeks. Maybe because I didn't want to explain everything from the beginning to someone who'd try to soften it. Yvonne didn't soften things, she just listened. When I finished, she said, "Okay, you need a lawyer." I said I had one, Roy's lawyer, a man named Gerald Ashworth who'd handled Roy's estate and still sent me a Christmas card every year. She said, "Call him tomorrow morning, first thing." I didn't sleep. I lay in my bed in the house. Roy built piece by piece, over 32 years, listening to the October wind come off the lake. And I thought about when Daniel was small. He used to be the kind of child who cried when he saw dead birds on the sidewalk. He used to draw me cards for no reason, not just birthdays, just random Tuesdays. A drawing of our house with everyone in the windows, the dog, even the cat we'd had before he was born, drawn from a photograph. He left them on the kitchen table where I'd find them in the morning. Where did that boy go? I genuinely did not know. Gerald Ashworth's assistant put me through the same morning. Gerald himself got on within minutes. I hadn't spoken to him in almost 2 years. When I said my name, he said, "Margaret, it's good to hear your voice." And then, because Gerald is the kind of man who reads people without trying to, he said, "Is everything all right?" I said no. I told him about the filing cabinet, the emails, the questions about oversight and estate access. I read him the sentences. The silence on his end was the professional kind, careful and absorbing. He said, "Margaret, can you come in tomorrow?" Yvonne drove me, again. Gerald's office was on Pandosi Street in a building Roy had always pointed out as we drove past. Old brick, Douglas fir trim, the kind of building that looks like it keeps its promises. Inside it smelled like coffee and paper. Gerald met us at the reception himself, which surprised me. He was older than I'd realized, white-haired now, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. He hugged me carefully and then looked at Yvonne. "This is Yvonne Bellaire," I said. "She's been helping me." He shook her hand warmly. "Then I'm already in your debt," he said. In his office, I laid out everything. The hospital, Daniel not coming, Claire's texts, the filing cabinet, the emails. Gerald read through the printouts I'd brought, while Yvonne sat quietly near the window, as far from the desk as she could get, as if she was trying to take up as little space as possible. When Gerald finished reading, he took his glasses off and set them on the desk. "There's something you should know," he said. I told him to go ahead. He said, "Roy was more careful than you probably realized." He opened a file from his cabinet. Roy had structured several of the larger assets, the rental unit on Raymer Avenue, the commercial investment accounts, 3 dividend holdings, in protected structures. Specifically because he was worried about what might happen after he was gone. Not worried about me, worried about Daniel. Gerald's expression was careful when he said it. Apparently Roy had come to see him privately, about 18 months before his diagnosis. He'd been watching some things with Daniel that concerned him. Financial impulsiveness, a period of significant spending that Roy couldn't account for. Gerald said, "He didn't want to burden you with it. He just wanted to make sure you were protected if something happened." I sat, very still. "What kind of spending?" Gerald folded his hands. "We believe there were some losses through private investment groups. Roy hired someone to look into it quietly. The figure was somewhere around $400,000 over about 3 years. The room felt like it was tilting slightly. $400,000. And Roy had known. And Roy had said nothing to me because he wanted to protect both of us. Me from the truth and Daniel from my reaction to it. "Does Daniel know that Roy knew?" I asked. "I believe he suspected," Gerald said, "which may explain some of what you found in that filing cabinet. Because if Daniel knew Roy had protected the estate, he'd need a different way in. He'd need to establish that I couldn't manage it myself." Yvonne made a small sound near the window. Not a word, just a sound. I looked at her and she looked at me, and neither of us needed to say anything. Gerald said there was more. The current will, he told me, left almost everything to Daniel directly, with a small provision for Ryan's education. It had been written 8 years ago, before Roy died, before any of this. He said, "You have every right to change it. And given what's in those emails, I think you should consider it." I looked down at my hands. Roy's wedding ring was on the chain around my neck, where I'd worn it since he died. I held it between my fingers. I thought about what Roy would say. He'd probably say something quiet and practical, the way he always said things. Something like, "Well, Maggie, you already knew what you had to do." I said, "Yes, I want to change everything." Gerald nodded slowly. Then he asked a second question, just as carefully. And your medical directive, your power of attorney for personal care, who holds that currently? Daniel. Of course, Daniel. I looked across the desk. Then I turned toward Yvonne, who immediately shook her head. That's too much, she said. I can't, I said. You came to drive me to a discharge appointment, and you've been there for everything since. You answer the phone when I call. You check on me without being asked. I looked at her steadily. I trust you. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, What if Daniel fights it? Gerald said he would. He said almost certainly he would. And then he said that Roy had one final piece of foresight. He'd requested Gerald document a formal capacities assessment during the estate revision process. There was already a baseline on file, signed by 2 physicians, dated clearly. Daniel would have very little ground to stand on. Yvonne looked at her hands for a moment. Then she said, quietly, Okay. 3 weeks later, Daniel called me. He'd been calling every few days since I got home from the hospital. More than he'd called in the previous 6 months. Always the same cheerful opening. Always the same thin current of anxiety underneath it. He'd heard something from someone at Roy's old firm. I knew eventually he'd say so directly. That particular evening he said, Mom, I got a call from Gerald Ashworth's office. I said, I know. A pause. What are you doing? I said, protecting myself. His tone shifted immediately. Not angry. Careful, like someone choosing their footing on ice. Mom, I'm trying to help you. The emails were just. I was looking into options. I was being proactive. I said, You were looking into how to access my accounts without a doctor's assessment. Silence. I found the papers, Daniel. I read them. More silence then. Those were private. So are my finances. The pause after that was very long. Then his voice changed again. Softer this time. And something underneath it that might have been real. I'm in trouble, Mom. I waited. The business it hasn't been doing well. For a while now. There are debts that Claire doesn't even fully know about. The reno is the least of it. I'm trying to figure out how to. He stopped. I was scared. I closed my eyes briefly. There it was. Not a villain. Just a frightened person who'd made wrong choice after wrong choice and eventually stopped being able to see his mother as anything except a solution to his problem. I said, You could have told me. He said, And say what? The truth. You could have said, Mom, I'm drowning, I need help. My voice stayed steady. I surprised myself. I would have helped you, Daniel. He didn't answer. I helped you when you were 22 and your car was repossessed. I helped you when you and Claire had that terrible first year and you couldn't make rent. I would have helped you again. He said very quietly. I didn't think I could ask again. So instead you decided to take. The silence after that was different from all the others. It had weight. Then he said, Are you cutting me out entirely? I said, No. I'd thought about that answer carefully. But I'm not handing you control of my life either. He was quiet for a long time. When he spoke again, he sounded young in a way that hurt me. Is she getting everything? The nurse? I said. That's not how this works, Daniel. The night after that call, Yvonne came over for dinner. I made the lentil soup Roy always liked, the one with the smoked paprika. It was the first time I'd cooked a real meal since before the surgery. We sat at the kitchen table and talked about small things for a while. Her daughter's school concert, the geese coming off the lake early this year, whether the winter would be bad. Then she said, How did it go? I told her about the call. She listened. When I finished, she said, Do you believe him? That he was scared? I said yes, I did believe him, and I said what I'd been thinking for weeks now. I think Roy saw it coming long before I did. He was trying to protect both of us, and it didn't work, but he tried. I held the soup bowl in both hands. I think I made it easier by never saying no to anything. I thought that was love. Yvonne didn't rush to argue with me. She just said, You were his mother. As if that explained everything. Because it does. Gerald held the formal meeting in December, 4 days before Christmas. He suggested neutral ground. His office. Not my house, not Daniel's, somewhere that belonged to neither of us. Yvonne drove me. Ryan came with Daniel and Claire, which I hadn't expected. He was in the back seat when they pulled up. He came straight to me and hugged me before anything was said. He'd gotten taller. He smelled like cold air and hockey equipment. Hi, Grandma. 2 words and somehow I felt steadier than I had in months. Inside, the 4 of us. Gerald, Daniel, Claire, and I sat in Gerald's conference room with its long pine table and the view of the mountain through the window. Yvonne waited in the lobby. She'd offered to stay outside, and I'd let her, because this part was mine to do. Claire's face was controlled and pleasant in the way faces get when someone has decided in advance not to react. Daniel looked tired. Not the tired of a busy man. The tired of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a long time. Gerald opened the folder and laid out the updated documents simply and clearly. The restructured estate. The foundation. I'd asked Gerald to name it the Bellaire Recovery Fund. Not after me, after Yvonne, because she'd be running it. Support for elderly patients in the Okanagan without adequate home care after surgery or medical crisis. Coordination with hospitals and care homes. A small operating staff. Roy's rental property on Raymer Avenue sold to fund the first 5 years. Claire said, "You're selling Roy's property." I said, "Roy would have liked what it's paying for." Daniel was staring at the table. He said, "What about the house?" Gerald said the house remained mine, with a clearly documented plan for its future. Daniel would receive a set amount. Not nothing, not a punishment, but a defined amount. Gerald explained it plainly. He said it in a way that made it a legal statement rather than a verdict, which I appreciated. Claire looked at me then. "After everything we've done for you," I thought about that for a moment. The hockey game the morning of my surgery. The text with the exclamation mark. The emails about cognitive decline. What they had done for me. I said, "Claire, I love your son, and I love Daniel. But I needed help in September and nobody came." She started to say something and I said gently, "Let me finish." She did. A woman I'd known for 2 days drove me home from the hospital and checked my medication and called me the next morning to make sure I hadn't fallen. She did that because she wanted to, not because she was waiting for anything. I looked at Daniel. "That's not nothing, that's everything." Daniel looked up from the table. His face had gone the way faces go when something finally breaks through. Not anger. Something older than anger. He said, "I'm sorry, Mom." Claire looked at him quickly. He said it again, just to me, quieter. "I'm sorry I wasn't there." I believe he meant it. I believed him then, and I believe it now. But Gerald was right about one thing. Apologies and trust are not the same thing. I said, "I forgive you, Daniel, I mean that." He nodded, eyes down. "But I've changed things and they're going to stay changed. And somewhere in that, I hope you'll find a way to be okay." He didn't say anything after that. Neither did Claire. Ryan, who'd been sitting in the corner chair the whole time, said softly, "What's the foundation going to do, Grandma?" I told him. He listened carefully. When I finished, he said, "That's good." 2 words, the same as in the parking lot, and they landed the same way. The Bellaire Recovery Fund opened in March, on a cold, bright morning when the lake was still partly frozen and the mountains were white all the way down. Gerald had found a space in Rutland. An old daycare building, warm and practical, nothing fancy. We painted it ourselves, a few of us, over 2 weekends. Yvonne's daughter helped. Roy's old curling buddy Walter came with a roller and didn't ask any questions. I stood at the front door when we opened it. The sign was simple. Yvonne didn't want her name on it, but I overruled her. The Bellaire Recovery Fund. I looked at those words for a long time. That first week we had 4 people. An 81-year-old man named Clifford who'd had a hip replacement and lived alone out past Winfield. A woman named Jean, 73, recovering from cardiac surgery, whose children were in Ontario and couldn't get time off. A retired teacher named Howard who couldn't do stairs and whose apartment had 3 flights. And a woman from West Kelowna, whose name I'll keep private because she asked me to, who'd been sitting in her house for 2 weeks after a fall with meals delivered to her door, and no one checking whether she'd eaten them. The morning Clifford arrived, he looked embarrassed carrying his single bag. Yvonne met him at the door and said, "We've got your room ready, kettle's on." He laughed a little, relieved and caught off guard by it. I recognized that laugh. I'd made it myself, 9 months earlier, in a hospital corridor, when someone treated me like I still mattered. Ryan came to help on the weekends sometimes. He rearranged furniture, moved boxes, drove people to pharmacy appointments. He didn't make a production of it, he just showed up. Daniel came once, in April. He didn't call ahead. He knocked on the door of the fund during a Thursday afternoon, and stood there with his coat on, and his hands in his pockets, looking like a person who isn't sure if they're welcome. I opened the door and looked at him for a moment. Then I stepped aside. He walked through every room quietly and didn't say much. On his way out, he stopped in the main room where Clifford was watching the news, and Jean was doing a crossword, and Howard was asleep in the good armchair by the window. Daniel looked at the room for a long moment. Then he said, "Dad would have liked this." I said, "I know." He nodded once and left. He sent me a letter the following week. Not an email. A letter, handwritten on plain paper. He wrote, "Mom, I've been trying to figure out how to say something that I don't think I knew how to face before. I thought the most important thing I could do was keep our family financially secure. I told myself that everything I did was for that reason. But I was lying to myself. I saw you getting older and I got scared. And I started treating you like a problem to be managed instead of a person to be loved. I don't have an excuse for that. I just have the truth, finally. You deserved better from me. You deserved better from me for a long time. I'm sorry, Mom. I'm going to spend whatever time I have left trying to be worth something to you again." I read it twice at the kitchen table with my coffee. Then I folded it and put it in the drawer where I keep Roy's last letter to me, the one he wrote in the hospital in the final week. Not because they're the same. They're not. But because they're both true, and truth deserves to be kept somewhere safe. That evening, Yvonne and I sat on the back porch of my house as the sun went behind Okanagan Mountain. The lake was flat and silver. A pair of geese passed overhead, low enough that we could hear their wings. I had tea. She had coffee. We didn't talk for a long time. Then she said, "I've been thinking about what you said when you offered me the fund." I waited. "You said you wanted to turn the worst thing that happened to you into something that helped people." I said, "Yes." She wrapped both hands around her mug. "I think Roy would have liked you for that." I smiled a little. "He already liked me." "I know," she said. "I meant the part where you didn't fall apart." I looked out at the lake. Roy's Mountain, we used to call it, the one you can see from the kitchen window on clear days. It was doing what it always does. Standing there, permanent and unbothered, doing its job just by existing. I thought about the morning of my surgery, the empty chair, the text message, the ceiling tiles. And I thought about everything that came after. The pain, the drawer, the emails, the meetings, the difficult conversations, the quiet ones. And I understood that none of it had broken me. It had changed me, which is different. Changed people still stand. They just stand somewhere new. I spent most of my life believing that love meant never asking for anything in return. That giving without limit was the highest form of caring. But love that never says no teaches people that your needs don't count. That you will always be there to absorb whatever comes. Maybe I taught Daniel that without meaning to. Maybe the most honest thing I ever did was finally say, "This is as far as I go." Because I've learned something in these past months that I wish someone had told me when I was young. Kindness is not the same as self-erasure. You can love someone completely and still protect yourself. You can forgive a person and still refuse to hand them the keys to your life. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the family that stays is not the one you were born into. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in blue scrubs, at the end of a double shift, with a piece of paper and a phone number and a willingness to show up. If this story touched something in you, please leave a comment below. Have you ever found family in someone you didn't expect? Or felt invisible to the people who were supposed to see you? I read every word you write. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. It matters to me. It truly does.